Hi, I'm Orrin, and today I'm going to show you how I've redesigned this scene from Squadron 42, only using the raw recordings from Penguin Grenade's library Advanced Propulsion 2. Thanks to Penguin Grenade for sending me a copy of their library. So let's listen to the final redesign first. So how I made this, as usual, I started with a load of source creation. This first rack I'm using here I've called Phase Doppler. It's basically me creating a kind of Doppler rack without using plugins like Spin Tracer, Traveler or Whoosh, kind of a more budget version. The main three elements of this rack are kilohertz pitch shifter, kilohertz gain, and kilohertz filter. The pitch shifter and gain are both just being automated here, up and down, to create the kind of Doppler effect. And the filter is having its cutoff modulated by the incoming signal volume. So I'll just play some of the fabric ripping source with just these first three effects so you can hear what it's doing. Then onto the more kind of creative experimental side of processing, we have kilohertz ensemble, which is kind of making it sound a bit more full and a bit more sci-fi. Vocoder, which is playing nicely off of the little kind of transients that we have here, and again, kind of putting it in the aesthetic that I want. Valhalla Space Modulator is having its mix and depth both modulated by the incoming signal volume, so you get this nice super phasey point at the peak of the sound, and the pitch kind of changes across the whole thing, which adds to the kind of Doppler effect. So listen to that here. M-Ratio MB is smoothing out a few of those transients after the vocoder, just so that it fits nicer in the whole mix. Here it is a little bit clearer on the cardboard sounds. Then onto the last stage of the rack, which is kind of making it sound good after I've gotten to the sound that I like. I have Fire, which is a really nice free distortion. Then OTT, which is just not quite flattening everything, but definitely bringing up some of the mids and making sure that we can hear the movement the whole way through. Finally, just dynamic EQ, not actually being used as a dynamic EQ because the low end was getting a bit much and the high end was not really sticking out enough. And then I have a limiter at the end just for some extra gain, and because I put it on all of my racks, just if I'm doing more experimental processing, I think it's necessary. So in terms of source here, I mainly went with these three main sources, which is the pillow flaps, the cardboard drags, and I experimented with these playing card shuffling, which kind of goes nicely into the vocoder, but ultimately was a bit too, it kind of wasn't dense enough for the sound to really work. And you can see I'm layering them up here, slightly panning them and pitching them around differently. So you see that's down 10 semitones, that's down 16. Here it's like, that's down 8, that's up half a semitone. When I'm doing this, I'm just dragging through the file like this for each one. So it's not the same exact source every time. I can kind of create variations really easily. So here's what it sounds like all together. There's a little crackle in there from M-Ratio MB, which you sometimes get, but it's not in the final result. So here's some of the best bits of source that I got from that. So the next rack that I have is this impact rack, and it's how I'm kind of generating those kicks and transients that are in the final redesign. This is quite a good way of getting transients from sustained sounds that sound pretty good. I'll turn everything off here. Initially just Supercharger GT. This is actually free with the complete access bundle from Native Instruments, which is just kind of flattening out the source before it goes into the rest of the processing so that you get more consistent results. Here it is on, I've mainly been using the kind of cat purrs. The distorted parachute turned out really well, and the vibrating foam roller turned out really well. So here it is on some of that source. Next is a kind of guilty pleasure, I guess, of mine, Diablo Light. It's from Cymatics. I think it has kind of a unique tone, a unique form of distortion that's a bit dirty that I like. Just doing a bit of hard clipping here. Next is kind of the main part of the rack, Kilohertz Transient Shaper. Attack all the way up, pump a little bit up and sustain all the way down, so you get this nice transient shape, which is exactly what I want. That sounds like this. Currently you can hear it's quite poppy, it's not really thumpy like I want it to be. So M-vocoder is actually helping with that. It's kind of giving it that pitch envelope that vocoding tends to do. With Morph 1 especially, which is a really cool setting on this, you get more of a kick shape. So you can hear there it actually sounds like a kick now, where it didn't before. BX subfilter, I'm just using this as a resonant low shelf, basically. I have the resonance on high. I'm giving it a tight punch around 70 Hertz, so slightly high for a kick, but I plan on pitching all these down anyway, so it's, I think, better to be a little bit higher than kind of right on. It gives you a bit more flexibility later. So here's how that sounds. It sounds a bit crazy now, but that's because I'm only adding that low end so that it kind of crunches a little bit more going into a little radiator, which sounds like this. So although we have that nice crunchy tone that we want, it's kind of killed the transient a bit. So I've just brought back Kilohertz Transient Shaper, almost the same settings but with the clip on, because I thought it sounded a bit better, which now sounds like this. Then at the end, just Kilohertz stereo, reducing the width a bit, but not all the way, because these kind of want to be in the center as the focus. I'll show you some of the source that I got from that. So you can hear a lot of those are really quite thumpy, and they don't sound like they came from a sustained source. And the other thing is, because you kind of have that tail leading off, you can use this as well, this bit at the end, as a nice bit of tail or extra bit of low thump after the kick, which can add a lot of power if you need. The next rack I'm going to show is Scanner. So this is the kind of classic Scanner XT. You put the sample in here, you go through the presets and kind of get loads of movement out of it. So going into this, I mainly wanted to use sounds that were pretty flat dynamically and already kind of distorted, because if something's already quite crunchy going into this plugin, it sounds really good when it kind of gets swept across those bits of distortions, and then when you kind of add more afterwards, it kind of glues it all together. You've noticed here, these are the things I was putting in there. I've taken them out and then glued them down to be only a couple seconds long, maybe 5 seconds max, because Scanner works best on very short waveforms. If you put something really long in there, it kind of barely moves across. So just on its own. It is cool that Scanner can give your sound transients where it didn't have it before, but for this, where I want it to be pretty flat and pretty kind of slammed, it's not necessarily what I want. So firstly, to deal with the resonance and the tonality, I'm frequency shifting it. So this is not fully getting rid of it, but definitely reducing some of that tonality. Then M-vocoder, not doing a whole lot, just putting it more in the aesthetic I want. Morph 2 here is slightly brighter and I think a bit more poppy than the classic vocoder setting. I tend to use it more often actually. It sounds like this. You hear there when it really slows down and gets super kind of crunchy. Kilohertz ensemble next, mainly just to add a little bit more movement with the kind of phasey, comb filtery tone that it gives you. Then Kilohertz distortion, pretty simple here, just gluing everything together, adding back the high end that some of these things have taken away. Then I've been messing around with this plugin recently. This just came out, it's from Minimal Audio and it's free. It's like a slightly different flavor of OTT, and I only have it mixed in at 25% because it's pretty crazy, pretty intense. So here's what that sounds like after the distortion, especially, sounds really good. Then finally, initial dynamic EQ actually being used as a dynamic EQ for once. Just taming some of the lows because squash and the distortion want to blow them out, and boosting some of these high mids because I'm planning on using it as like the thruster / afterburner for the ship. So you get that kind of crackly rocket ship-esque tone from it that this is definitely the area I want to hit with it. So here's how that sounds. So I put a few different things in there as source. The gong didn't end up working very well. It's kind of too static, you see. But the foam roller was pretty good. Definitely mainly the distorted parachute recordings because they're just really good. The light to sound Faucet especially sounded really good. It already has the kind of crackly stuff, but in a slightly different tone to the parachute. So here's some of the source that I got out of that. So definitely a lot more movement, definitely sounds more sci-fi, and you'll see in the final result it adds a lot of power to the engine of the ship. The last rack I want to show you here is this tonal rack, which is mainly based around these two delays here, which are set super close to each other, and I'm just constantly moving them around as I'm doing the source creation. If I turn everything else off. So as you probably know, if you put a delay on something with the feedback really high and the delay time super short, you kind of create a tone. So just one, it sounds like this. It sounds quite robotic, but quite interesting. I had the idea just to stack two of them together, so they sound like this now. And already I think that's a really cool kind of sound. And if you just move the delay time slightly separately, you can hit these kind of sweet spots where they resonate against each other in a really interesting way. So after these two delays, I have kilohertz pitch shifter, which is just at the bottom here, doing a bit of pitch shifting downwards as the source goes on, just to give it more of a kind of, I think, darker tone. I think it sounds a lot cooler when it's slightly changing pitch. Sounds a bit more like it's moving further away from you. Space Modulator and Ensemble are doing similar things here and just making the pitch sound a little bit more natural. It's not as robotic now, because before it kind of sounded like it was coming out of a synth. So now it sounds a little bit more like it's coming from a real source, slightly. M ratio MB is tapering off some of that harsh high end that the delays give it. So it's just a bit more focused on the tone itself, and it'll fit nicer in the mix as well, because as you've heard, we have a lot of high, very bright stuff. So I want this to fit in the kind of mids, low mids of the final redesign. So here's how that sounds. So it sounds a bit more simple now, tonally, I think. Initial EQ again, just making it a bit more balanced. I know I said I wanted to take out those high end, but it kind of needed a little bit more boost after M ratio, and it's also controlling that low end again. And then another kilohertz limiter just at the end here. So in terms of source, there's two ways you can go about using this rack. One is to use something super short and just use it to set off the delays, so it's not really giving much of its own, character to the sound like I'm doing here. Another option is to use a sound that has a lot of tonality itself, which kind of plays off of the delays and gives you three main tones, which sounds a bit more interesting, like this Theragun on plastic tubes. It's got that nice low, mid kind of growl to it. So going off of the delays, it sounds a bit more unique. Then the third option is to use something with an interesting dynamic shape, like the wind whistle parachute recordings again. These are quite cool and crunchy, as you've heard before. And that kind of trailing off crunchy sound, which is slightly longer than the other waveforms, can help with giving it a bit more character in the tail. You can hear how it's kind of getting a bit crunched up without sounding necessarily distorted, which I think is really cool. So here's some of the source that I got from this. So now that we've done the source creation, we can move on to the actual redesign itself and how I put that together. So the redesign I've separated into 5 main groups that are just organized by processing type, as well as this main engine, which I'll go into next. As you can see, there's a lot of automation going on. This is kind of necessary, I think, with sci-fi engines just to make them sound real and give them more movement. If I turn all the effects off and just show you the source that I'm working with. So the first layer here is this light to sound faucet again, which is just giving us this kind of base layer of crunch. Next is this prop plane or drone, which had a really nice tonality that I liked. It's kind of one of the main layers here. And I've just taken the start of one of the recordings when it's spinning up and the end and just spliced them together so you get this rising and falling motion as the ship gets closer and further away. Next is this bullet train recording. This sounded nice and screamy and evil, which I liked, because if you look, the ship itself looks kind of evil. I think it's obviously kind of a bad guy ship. This is being distorted quite a bit and then EQ to take all the lows out after. So the distortion is hearing all of that nice low end and making it nice and crunchy. And then I'm just basically keeping that screamy resonance in there. Next is this treadmill start, and I've taken 2 of these takes and reversed this one so that same with the prop plane, it kind of comes in and out. So it feels like it's charging up and then releasing afterwards. It's kind of a more subtle element, but I think having the charge up start right from the beginning of the clip gives it a nice sense of tension the whole way through. The next layer is a bounced reverb, just from a super slowed down tail of a drone. To me, this had like a massive TIE fighter vibes, and that's exactly what I was going for with this. So I just compressed it so it was a bit more even, and then put Valhalla Supermassive with massive amount of feedback, high density, 100% mix, so that I could basically have this tonality go on for as long as I wanted. So after that's been bounced out, it sounds like this without effects. And then all I've done here is distort it slightly with a more analog style distortion. And then I have this high cut on here, which I'm taking off with automation just at the points where I think it's the most intense. So you get that screamy high end that the distortion's adding, but only at certain times. So with effects, it sounds like this. It sounds a bit cheesy on its own, but it does work in the whole mix. Then the final layer of this kind of sustained part of the engine is this subwoofer vibration, which has had this really lovely kind of purring sound to it that I think sounded very powerful. Then finally here, I just have these maneuvers from drones. I'll play one of them on its own as it was originally intended. So I've just taken those, put 3 of those together and pitched them down loads. So when it flies past initially here, then when it flies away later, you kind of get this more whooshy sound. So I'll play those on their own. And with all of these sustain layers here, the effects are pretty much just filtering, apart from the 2 distorted ones, just to make sure that they all have their own space in the frequency spectrum and they're not stepping on each other's toes. So some are more based in the high mids, some are low mids, some are lows. So moving on to the effects now that I just have on all of these. First is kilohertz pitch shifter. This is mainly just doing Doppler movement. It's being automated. It's giving that kind of ramp up there, which sounds a bit goofy on its own, but in the whole mix it sounds good. Next, and vibrato, which is just subtly giving it a bit of pitch variation and making it sound a bit more real and grounded. Next is Newfangled Audio's Obliterate. This is also new and also free. I think it makes it sound very angry in a way that I really like. It's giving us a lot of crackly highs and kind of doing the first part of gluing all those layers together. Kilohertz Flanger here is adding a lot more movement. Then Kilohertz Ring Mod. This is something that I only really discovered while playing around with this sound. If you put it on the low pass noise setting, it almost acts as a distortion, but without fully destroying the sound. It doesn't blow out the low end or make it super muddy. It just kind of crunches it up. So I'm automating this in here at the same time as kind of everything else is peaking to kind of add to the sense of intensity from the engine. If I put it up to just 100% the whole time, then you can see the kind of effects it has. So here it's like distorted, but not blown out, if that makes sense. Kilohertz Ensemble is adding more movement, kind of doing the same thing as Flanger, but I think after the ring mod, it has quite a nice sound as it's being kind of crunched up. M Tremolo doing a lot of heavy lifting here, also having its rate automated. This is kind of suggesting the state of the engine and kind of how hard it's working, especially in the lead up to the big boost away. You can hear that kind of gives it one of the main parts of its sound. Ozone 10 here, I'm just using as an EQ. You can actually get the EQ from Ozone on its own for free with the complete start bundle that I talked about before. So I'm not actually doing anything super crazy here. Boosting the low end a little bit just to give it a bit more power at the start. And then the gain on this shelf here is being modulated negatively. So it's going down when basically the other low end elements hit. So at the start, you have this big feeling of power and then it gets out of the way as soon as the actual powerful stuff starts to come in. So I'll show you that. Kilohertz Compressor is also just being sidechained to the impacts. And then Kilohertz Stereo is just controlling the stereo width at the start and end. So when it's further away, it's not as wide. So here's what that sounds like altogether. So next we have the folder with all the tonal elements in. I only ended up using these 4 in the final design. This one here is just kind of giving us a base layer as kind of a layer of the main engine itself. And it just has a little bit of pitch shifting on here being automated, again, to give it a bit more movement. It's been pitched way down because I think that low mid area is quite complementary to the main engine at that point, whereas that frequency area is getting a bit blown out later, so I couldn't put it in the later parts of the redesign. This high tone here is being used as a riser into the main kind of boost, and then this little one here is kind of part of the tail. And this one here is something a bit more aggressive and bright that lasts for a bit longer. And then processing on the whole stack, I just have another pitch shifter doing a bit of Doppler right at the end, some distortion, which is adding a bit more punch and filling out the frequencies a little bit more. That distortion right towards the end there especially, I think sounds really cool. Then dynamic EQ, taking out all the lows because they're just not necessary for this. And then lastly, just a bit of reverb because they sounded a bit too close and I wanted to smear some of that detail a bit. So now onto the impact folder. For the kicks themselves in this stack here, I've kind of arranged them into this little pattern, which I think is quite satisfying. So I have these ones here in the middle, which are high passed. And then these main ones here have some distortion, 2 distortions, just to make them super fat and like really stand out in the mix. And then these kind of extra ones, which are a bit cleaner. I'm also just taking the tail from one and putting it on this one because I thought it was lacking a bit of low end in the tail. I'm also taking just the tail from one of the foam roller impacts that I made and layering it here at the end with some high shelving as a kind of powerful, clean, low tail. Then on the whole kick stack, I have subfilter, just adding more low end, which might not be super necessary, but I think going into distortion, I just wanted them to be super insanely crunchy. More crunch and less cleanness lends itself well to this kind of design. Then kilohertz distortion. Transient shaper, just boosting these attacks here so they poke out a little bit more and taking down the sustain. Initial EQ again, just boosting the lows a little bit more around the kind of thumpy, chest thumpy range, ducking the mids very slightly and then boosting a lot of the crunch that I've added. Then finally, limiter, just reducing some of the gain because it was getting really crazy. So alongside those kicks in the impact stack as well, I have these reversed kicks, which are going into the first ones, and just an unchanged, well, pitched down, but otherwise unchanged light to sound faucet again, which are kind of giving a bit of extra interest and a bit more transient crunch at that point right before it's about to actually boost off. Then I'm just taking out the low end so that it doesn't interfere with the kicks themselves. So for the whole impact stack, I just have this EQ, which is barely doing anything, and then kilohertz stereo, making it fully mono. So altogether, it sounds like this. And as an extra thing that I added is just this pitched down drone flyby, which just has the lows taken out and some of the stereo width taken out, just because I think it added this really cool whippy sound in between the kicks and then alongside the kicks. Now onto the phasey whooshes. I have these ones here as the kind of charge up and tail off, similar to the tonal ones, and as well like the tonal ones, I have this one here that's just adding a bit of texture right at the start. So here's what they sound like without any processing. So you can hear the phasiness is there, the kind of low mid rumble is there. On these ones I just have a high pass filter. Next is this tail, which I didn't end up using that, but I just made this kind of jet-like tail, which sounds like this, from some drone flybys, which sound like this raw. I used a frequency shifter to get rid of a lot of that tonality. Filter, which is being modulated by the input signal to calm down some of the tails and give it a bit more interesting movement across the sound. More subfilter into distortion to kind of crunch it up a bit more. EQ just to take out all that low end because I didn't need it while keeping the crunch. Then M ratio MB, taking some of the high end out of the very end of the tails. So as a whole, they sound like this. So as a whole, with the other phasey tails, they sound like this. I think they're fitting quite well with them. Then on the whole stack, super simple, just some EQ, which is putting it in the right place. It's got these low mids, it's got these high ends. This high mids belongs to the crunch and the low end as well. Then another compressor, which is the same as the main engine one, it's just being sidechained to the kicks, so it gets out the way when it needs to. So as a whole, they sound like this. Now onto the final section, which is the crunches, which is separated into these two subfolders, which is the constant and the impact. I'll go over the constant one first. These are just some bits of the source that I showed you earlier that have been arranged, pitched around to sound good. This is meant to be just the basic engine as you normally hear it. It's got a bit of volume automation just so that you hear it, especially when it comes into view, but it's always there, just giving it a bit of extra crunch and power. It sounds like this without effects. And then the effects that I'm adding are more squash, kind of boosting that high end, making it a bit more squashed in the dynamics, and I think just giving it more power. I want this to feel like it's really ripping through the space around it as it's kind of propelling the ship forward. Then the distortion. Dynamic EQ here, controlling that low end but not completely taking it out. And then just at the end, some stereo to reduce the width because it is in front of you the whole time, so it didn't make a whole lot of sense for it to be super wide. Now onto the impact. It sounds like this without any effects. So you can see where I was going with that feeling of power. It's kind of the main body and tail of the ship flying away. In terms of processing, it's processed separately. So I have that squash and distortion again, just doing exactly the same thing. I'm actually automating the mix of squash so that it sounds a bit more intense right at the high point and then isn't quite as crazy in the tail and the build-up. Here's the distortion. Solid dynamics is just crushing it a bit more, just controlling the dynamics and then just catching it at this impact here, which I think sounds pretty cool. Then EQ, doing the same thing. I don't really have to go into it that much. This low end here is being negatively modulated by the kicks so that the low end gets out of the way when the kicks hit and then steps right back in as soon as they're over. Then right at the end, just a transient shaper, because although I like the compression on the impact, it was making the fade out a little bit too compressed, so it wasn't really trailing off. So this sustain being a bit down is just helping it trail off a little bit more naturally. And then I don't have any effects on the crunch stack as a whole because it's split into those two. Now, onto the processing on the entire redesign. First, you have M compressor. I really like this compressor for mixing and putting on stacks of loads of things, much more than I like using it on individual things. I think it just fits that role really well. I think it sounds really powerful. Then Panks, not doing a whole lot, just clipping, and then doing a little bit of tail shaping on the highs and lows. Then M Saturator is just doing a bit of parallel compression on the soft setting. I think it's really great at gluing things together. TDR Nova, this is a free dynamic EQ that I like to use if I want to do things that are a little bit more subtle than initial dynamic EQ. This is just controlling the low end with a pretty fairly slow attack, so it lets those kicks through but doesn't let it linger and kind of overpower for too long, as well as those high end, the 13K, because I think it was getting just a little bit too crazy at times as well. It's a very high end, heavy piece. Then finally, Ozone 10 here, just doing this tiniest bit of EQing, and I'm also just reducing the width of the low end below 90 Hertz. So here's what the whole thing sounds like with none of that kind of mastering done. And here it is with all that mastering done. It's quite subtle, but I think it just makes it a bit more powerful and crunchy. So that's going to be it for this video. Thanks again to Penguin Grenade for sending me a copy of Advanced Propulsion 2. I hope I gave you some ideas for ways that you can mess around with it and create interesting effects racks, and I'll see you guys later.